Well, let's start in any case. It's 5:32. We have a slight time constraint, as you've mentioned. So, well, firstly, Ranjit, thank you for graciously agreeing to have a chat with us on modernism. So, okay, the webinar, I just got the message, is now live on Facebook as well. Having a discussion on modernism and Bhanu Athaiya. I mean, many months ago, I'd contacted you. We had the Bhanu Athaiya estate that was consigned to us, and I thought that, who could be the best person to write about it and possibly introduce, because, I could see that there was a lot in there. And to share my excitement with you, I mean, we were originally asked to come in to look at her book collection, and then, of course, we saw all the artworks on the side, and and then I began to read up, and I realized that, wow, this is a very important part of modernism, and maybe a story that has not been discussed enough. So in that vein, I mean, let's get started. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of points here that are extremely important to the discourse on modernism. I suspect that the auction catalog will be, and your write-up specifically, will be referred to time and time again. Because I think Bhanu Athaiya's estate has provided us an opportunity to kind of melt together a lot of the thoughts, because clearly, looking at your write-up, it's not something that happened overnight. It was something in your mind. You have written parts of it earlier, and it just came together in a beautiful way for this upcoming auction. Let's start, before anything else, before we get to the contentious second question. Let's start on education. Education is something, art education specifically, something extremely important. And in your write-up, you've mentioned that Solomon basically transformed the South Kensington style of syllabus of JJ. We know E.B. Havel's contribution in Government College of Art and his influence on Rabindranath Tagore. Amrita Shergill, of course, studied the École des Beaux-Arts. I mean, completely not the Royal Academy, but I'm guessing, and I'm waiting to hear your thoughts on her, that type of education. And point being that, education and the change from what you've described as the South Kensington style of education, which is basically using art for everyday lives, in a very simply being, just painting a teapot, to something a much more, art for art's sake, study of human anatomy, study of form, study of live models, and all of that. That was, a huge change that was brought about by Solomon and some of these early people who were responsible or had important positions in the art schools in India. So can you talk about a little bit about the education scene? And you've mentioned 5 or 6 different styles of art education in India that existed. And because I think it has an important role to play in the development of modernism. You're on mute. You are on mute.
Yeah, brilliant. I'm back. Yes. Indrajit, thank you so much. In the first place, let me just say how wonderful it's been to collaborate with you on this adventure, because Bhanu Athaiya, as I say in my essay, is someone who, as a child and as a teenager, of course, I knew her, like we all did, as a costume designer, a very sophisticated costume designer for the movies. And of course, we all know that she won an Oscar for her work on Attenborough's Gandhi. But very early in my time as an art critic, I learned from D.G. Nadkarni, from Prafulla Dahanukar, from Shaila Parekh about her work as an artist and how she'd been very much on the scene in the late 40s and early 50s. So it's marvelous that this is being rediscovered now. So the more I think about someone like Bhanu Athaiya, the more I am led to think about the extremely vibrant scenario as far as art education is concerned in the India of the first half of the 20th century. We tend to assume that something called the JJ pedagogy was stable and forever. We forget that in 1918, at the end of the First World War, when Gladstone Solomon arrives in Bombay and takes over as principal of the JJ School of Art, and eventually also as curator of the Prince of Wales Museum, he brings about a revolution in art education in Bombay. Because the JJ School, up until that point, like art schools across the British Empire, really was based on the South Kensington curriculum. And we all use this term in a reasonably loose sort of way, so I want to put some flesh on those bones. The South Kensington system is really the brainchild of Richard Burchett, who was an artist and a pedagogue, and he was on the margins of the pre-Raphaelite movement. So he emerged from also this great ferment in Britain during the 1840s, the 1850s, around the exposition, around the Crystal Palace, around this idea that the empire was a clearinghouse for different sorts of styles and idioms and different kinds of forms of art making. So out of that churn comes the South Kensington system, which was really geared to produce people who would excel at teaching art. It was primarily a system geared to produce art teachers, to produce draftsmen, draftspersons for the great imperial systems of botanical classification, archaeology, and so on and so forth. So if you look at the chapters of that syllabus, they are geared to producing machinists, ornamentalists, people who excel in the decorative arts, engineers, people who excel in technical drawing. And this is really the kind of education that was imparted at schools like the JJ up until that point. So they produced what, in another context, in the Calcutta context, this system was meant to produce the draft babus, so to speak. So when Solomon arrives, he brings about a revolution. He was a South African who had studied at the Royal Academy, and he insisted that all this sort of business of the everyday application of art, the decorative arts, all this should be put to one side. It should be replaced by the Royal Academy manner. So life studies is instituted for the first time. So for the first time, Indian students in Bombay actually paint from the nude, from the life models, you see. So, and alongside this, Solomon gets involved with the race for the architectural and artistic commissions in the new capital. Yeah. By the time New Delhi gets going in the late 20s and 1930s, Baker and Lutyens, the architects, are busy commissioning artists to decorate the new government buildings. And Solomon gets in on that. He competes with his opposite numbers in Calcutta and elsewhere. And he creates really something that you might want to call Bombay Orientalism. It is, in fact, called that, where he produces an ethos where, on the one hand, Indian students are being trained in the Royal Academy manner, but they're also responsive to the Ajanta murals, they're responsive to the miniatures. So you're looking at a pedagogy which was substantially rich. In hindsight, now you might want to see that as slightly mannered. But I think as students of history, we need to go back into that time and see what was contemporary, what was modern at that time. So, and we're talking about Solomon. Alongside Solomon was also the figure of the headmaster of the JJ, meaning the senior most Indian teacher, Dhurandhar. And there were students of Solomon's and Dhurandhar's like Ahivasi and Dhupeshwarkar, who really set the trend for what Bombay artists would be painting through the 1930s, the 40s, even the 50s. If you look at Bhanu Athaiya's work at the art school, you see the clear impress of these masters. If you see the student work of anyone else, the progressives, if you will, Gaitonde, Souza, and others, their student work bears the clear impress of this. And this was a very substantial and robust training in picture making. Sorry, I seem to be going on and on, Indrajit. So
that's absolutely, because I just thought I'd mention that Bhanu, in fact, has mentioned that one of her works, Ahivasi, in fact, mentioned that it was very had a lot of rust and maroon, and when Bhanu goes on to say that those were colors from Kolhapur that she had observed. So Aivasi was definitely and documented by her as one of her tutors at the JJ.
Absolutely. And remember that Ahivasi becomes synonymous with this kind of so-called modern Indian miniature. But he was steeped in a study of the Jain tradition, the various Rajput schools, the Mughal folios. And the wager there was to see how this inherited material could be brought into play in a contemporary setting. It was a different journey than the one taken, say, by Abanindranath Tagore and his circle. So to round off this business of what forms and experiments in art education were going on at that time in India, let's just widen our scope. On the one hand, there's what is usually just called the Bengal school, which does no justice to the different kinds of experiments that were going on there. People were looking back at the Mughal and the Rajput miniatures. They were looking out at the notion of the sublime landscape. They were looking at what was going on in Central European art. They were open to the Blauer Reiter and later the Bauhaus. These were not people who were stuck in any Indic twilight. From there, you find the transition to what you might want to call the Shantiniketan Circle, with Nandalal Bose, Vinod Bihari Mukherjee, Ramkinkar Baij, their circle. That's an indigenously achieved modernism that is hugely responsive also to a transcultural engagement with China, with Japan. Mm-hmm. There's a cosmopolitanism there. So here in this little forest retreat in Bolpur are people whose imagination carries right across the Asian landmass in space and in time all the way back to Dunhuang. So this is an incredible grassroots cosmopolitanism. In Chennai, for instance, there's a turning to reclaim the classical past of everything that is inherited, say, from the Chola period, from Kalamkari, from the arts and crafts of the peninsula. Elsewhere, artists like Sadikeyan, for instance, are active. They are exploring and retrieving the tradition of Islamic calligraphy. They also are looking back at the miniatures. They're drawing also on the literary tradition of Urdu. So there's an experimentation going on with text and image, for instance. We shouldn't forget these things because we tend to lump all this together in the lost decades between, say, 1909 and 1949. 4 lost decades, which we need to look at in a far more intense way to amplify our sense of what the Indian modern really was. It wasn't just 4 or 5 people.
So I remember ages back when I'd asked somebody this question, and you were still kind in talking about Bengal, Chennai, Sadike, and others. I mean, sometimes I get a simple answer. There's moderns and there's pre-moderns. The entire 1909 to 1949 has been, I think, mislabeled and bucketed in what's called a pre-modern, which is completely incorrect. I mean,
absolutely.
So it's in a sense, your write-up is a continued discussion about a focus that should go into that period. And I think this would be a good segue into the next question, which is the crux of the whole discussion on modernism that you have written about. And I will add to this that, I mean, the import of the write-up and the research is extremely important. And I suspect that the write-up and the auction catalog and will be discussed or need to be discussed and read a lot more. And of course, it's not something that's happened overnight. I would just like to point out that, again, before we started for your research, a lot of the discussions seem to be around who is and is not a part of the progressives. So is this the first wave? There's a document with a scribbled year on it that's described as the first wave. Then there's a second wave which relies on the 1953 exhibition catalog. Interestingly enough, the first 2 exhibition catalogs, I mean, I really tried to find it, but I have not been able to locate it. And it seems that the second exhibition was actually possibly held in Calcutta, but there is no exhibition catalog that I've been able to lay my hands on. So there's this small pamphlet with a few names, which is described as the first version. And then there's the 1953 group catalog, which describes the second version. And then in addition to that, there are, so some people refer to as associates. Interestingly enough, some of the artists that have been described as associates have said, look, I had nothing to do with the progressives because I was better than them. So, but the discourse has always been, okay, this person is part of progressives or not part of progressives. And that seems to be the end-all, be-all discussion of modernism when it comes to India, as who is a part of progressive. So and as you've mentioned, the canon around the progressive seems to have been not too far back. This seems to have been around since 1990s. And, just to quote you, I mean, you said it's all tosh. Basically, the discussion around modernism in India is not centered around the definition of who or who was not in the progressive artist group. So, I mean, how does one assimilate this? How does one begin to re-understand or rededicate oneself as a student of art or as an art lover or somebody who's a collector, somebody who's a researcher, into assimilating all this? Because in the last 10, 15 years, the discourse has been around a particular group that you have yourself described as a moment and not a movement. And even more interestingly so, you have said even the name progressive comes from the Communist Progressive Writers Group. So I'm just curious, how does one, like, as somebody walk into the room, I mean, I'm going to be listening to this and say, hold on, how do I assimilate this? I mean, what's going on here? What do I do? Do I need to unlearn? Do I need to reread? I mean, how do I assimilate this information?
Okay. My first response to that would be to say simply that when we're thinking about a subcontinent like South Asia, and I'm going to say South Asia because this history goes back to before 1947. So we're also thinking of Lahore as an important artistic hub at this time. Bombay, Calcutta, Delhi, Chennai, Madras to a certain extent, Lahore certainly, and a great deal that was going on in the princely states. And I'll come to that in a moment. Because when we talk about India, we tend to, we look at these metropolitan centers and we're very pleased with ourselves. We forget that through the last decades of the 19th century and all the way up into the 50s, the princely states were an extraordinary source of patronage for the arts and culture. To name just a few of them: Mysore, Travancore, Indore, Baroda, of course, some of the Rajput states, Alwar, Kapurthala. And if we ignore what was going on in these seeming outposts, which weren't really outposts, we're actually missing out on the texture of patronage and production in the arts. But I'll come to that in due course. My main answer right now would be to simply say, why on God's earth would we focus on one center in what is actually a polycentric universe of artistic and cultural production? Even if you look at the years in which the progressives proper were students, and then when we look at the years of their, when they were young artists, Calcutta had the Calcutta group. They were a group of young artists as well. Bani Sen, Vinod Mazumdar, Paritosh Sen, Shubho Tagore, and others in that grouping. In Lahore, there were Bhavesh Sanyal and others. They then moved to Delhi, where you then have the Shilpi Chakra. You have yet another group there. You have, in fact, you have several centers in the early years of independent India, where there are artists who are dealing with roughly similar questions of context, of practice. How were they to be citizens contributing to a new nation state? How were they to assimilate the tradition they inherited? How were they to become part of a larger international ensemble of modernist practice? These were questions that assailed young artists everywhere. What we are missing out when we focus only on one set of artists in one city is this larger sense of a network that was indubitably in place. The very fact that the progressives were aware of what was going on in Calcutta, they wanted to show there, they showed there, demonstrates that there was a larger network that we might imagine. Remember also that when some of the progressives and their young friends go to Delhi to see the Burlington House show at the Viceregal Lodge, there, as we would today say, they were blown away by the tradition that under Sousa's influence they had tended to negate. This is where Husain sees Gupta sculpture, for instance. This is where Tayyib takes on board what the 3,000 years of Indian sculpture has to offer. This is where they come face to face with the miniatures. And really, they expand their sense of their own cultural consciousness. So what strikes me as sad is that the progressives in their own life and work were expansive figures. I should also throw into this conversation the fact that over many years of conversation with Krishan Khanna, I've come to appreciate just how much an artist like Krishan Khanna was aware of the constraints under which the progressives were operating. He's several times said to me and to many others, including his biographer, that for him, the constraint of the two-dimensional space was something he wanted to fight. So whenever he's worked on the mural scale, it's a way for him to embrace the mural traditions, the great traditions of temple statuary. So by capturing the progressives in this very narrow understanding of masters who produce iconic paintings, we're actually doing their own work and their own practice an injustice, quite apart from isolating them from the richer, more lively context of which they were a part. And as to why we do this, I can only say that, as Indians, we suffer from what I think of as the Sampradaya complex. We want to know who's inside and is a proper believer or devotee, who's outside, who can be promoted to membership of this cult. This is meaningless. It's useless. Somebody like Mohan Samant, for instance, an extraordinary artist who I've somewhere else described as one-man avant-garde. His work was not even well understood until very recent times, because the only preoccupation people had was, was he really a progressive or not? Why are we so stuck on these labels? Let's look at the practice. Let's look at the complexity and the unpredictability of artistic practice.
Right, and you mentioned that, again, just reiterating what you said, it's not about the definition of who was in this group or not. It's almost like, in finance, you have these stock indexes. Are you part of the Nifty or you're not part of the Nifty? But this is art. I mean, and you've said something you've said very eloquently, that there are more continuities than disjunctures between the progressive and their unsung contemporaries. It means that art is something that evolves, it's something that's hybrid. And by focusing on a particular group, we've completely ignored 1909 to 1947, 49. Yes. That's one complete that we have, ignored. Even after that, we seem to focus a lot on, again, the group and its definitions and nothing else. That just, how is it possible? I mean, this goes into my third question, possibly. Can language have something to do with it? I mean, India is very unique because of the variety of languages that it has. And like when I was looking at the Atul Bose estate, for example, I noticed that many of the cuttings, newspaper cuttings, etc., were all in Bengali. Now, even Bengali as a language has changed. 40 years ago, it was much more formal. Now it's much more colloquial. Somebody reading Bengali 40 years ago may not be able to fully fathom the nuances of all the words. There's a very important catalog, Resume of Artists of Bengal by Kamal Sarkar, again, entirely in Bengali. Marathi, you mentioned Natkarni, a lot of his books are in Marathi, in fact. There are other journals, Ratnakar, and something which I've seen a couple of pages here or there, again, all in Marathi. Now, I've just mentioned these two languages, but is it possible that, in the 90s, again, we had the advent of social media, internet, and English discourse and the progressives. And it's almost like, but in India, we seem to have ignored a lot of the early modernist research, which were possibly in different languages. And that's, again, something very unique to India, because it's not like in France, Cézanne or Picasso's or works were described in any other language other than French, and that's continued throughout. So everything that was written, 100 years ago or 120 years ago is fully available and on record, on file for people to read and research and add on. Whereas in India, the whole notion of all the local languages, is it causing a problem? So, like, when it comes to art criticism, Is it possible that there's a disjuncture actually happening because of this language problem? Do you think?
There absolutely is. Thank you for the question, Indrajit, because it's really a very vital part of this whole crisis, if you will. It also speaks to the fact that because so many of us now tend to be effectively monolingual, even if we're multilingual in our knowledge of languages, we also tend to miss out on just how lively our public space was in the first half of the 20th century. You're looking at a flourishing situation of print modernity, as I would call it, across languages. And you're absolutely right. Criticism of the arts, not only of the visual arts, but also of music, theater, dance, and so on, took place in a variety of languages. And I wouldn't even really call them local languages, because many of our languages are actually global. They've gone out in our diaspora, in the Indian diaspora. They are practiced and published elsewhere as well. So I think we also need to recalibrate our stance towards our languages. If we do that, as you just did, we would then follow that and realize that a great deal of very interesting work was done in Bangla, in Marathi, in Hindi, in Urdu, in Tamil, in Malayalam. And there are these archives of art criticism that indeed some scholars are beginning to look at now. So, but when we get there, we'll also find a refreshing diversity of aesthetic positions. For instance, if you compare what is going on in these languages with what's going on in, say, the Anglophone public sphere, you'll also see that, say, in the 1920s and 30s, Anglophone writing would be wrestling with questions raised perhaps by John Ruskin, or questions raised by the arts and crafts movement. In Hindi or in Bangla, for instance, the questions might be inflected more by a notion of how can we continue using rasa theory? What role can Sanskrit aesthetics play? Think about, for instance, the writing that appears in Rupam. Think about the writing that appears in Modern Review. You will see that different aesthetic systems are in play as well. If I'm not mistaken, it was Binoy Sarkar who wrote both in English, Bangla, and in French, right? So we're also looking at incredibly polyglot critical production here. And with it, as I said, different kinds of aesthetic systems at play. What tends to happen today in a lot of Anglophone criticism is also, I'm trying to say this gently, there's
left anymore.
There's a marked absence of any larger aesthetic framework. And there's also, to a large extent, an absence of a historical consciousness, a historical sensibility that takes on these questions. You'd think that our contemporary art world was on a space station. And indeed, it is part of a larger set of global circulations. But how does it connect back to what is going on here? How do we form those connections? What are the pasts, the histories, and I use the plural advisedly, that we can reconnect with? I think these are vital questions for us as practitioners. And I think we'll also, and I'm glad we're fixing on these lost decades, the 4 lost decades, because when you go back there, you're also going to, what you'll find is that the visual arts did not proceed in isolation. I mean, I remember even when I began as an art critic and through my early socialization, architects were in conversation with filmmakers, poets were in conversation with painters, theater makers were in conversation with sculptors. There was a vast give and take across the arts. To a certain extent, I find that the visual arts today in India are much narrower in their inward-looking attitude, and I think that that is a great problem. And I think that to harp on one of my current favorite topics, the benighted, the much maligned princely states of India. When you look at these states, take Kolhapur for instance, because Bhanu Rajopadhyay was born there and she was formed by that culture.
That'd be a good thing to segue into Bhanu's emergence as a modernist. I mean, you mentioned 3 things. One of them, of course, is Kolhapur. So
yeah. So look at Kolhapur in the early 20th century. I mean, under Chhatrapati Shahu Maharaj and then his son Rajaram III, Kolhapur is an extraordinary center of social ferment. These rulers, who are descendants of Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj, as it happens, they supported the anti-caste and the untouchability movements. They supported Dr. Ambedkar's early work, and they were at the forefront of social reform and social revolution. So princes, kings who wanted to overthrow this millennial system of caste oppression. Over on the other hand, Kolhapur also was an early center of Indian cinema in the silent movies and the talkies. It was thanks to the rulers and their circles and rippling out across classes. It was also a center for patronage for painting, for the visual arts. Remember the Dhurandhar himself, who played such a major role in Bombay and the JJ context, came from Kolhapur, as did a number of other people, Abalal Rahman, for instance. These were all Kolhapur artists. So, and I'm talking about cinema here. There's also theater. There's the lively Lavani context of song spiel. You're looking at what we might want to think of as a small town, a small city. These are meaningless descriptions. A city like Kolhapur was cosmopolitan. It was a global center in its own way. And we have to really rewire ourselves and our understanding of what makes for a metropolis, what's a tier 2 city, what's a tier 3 city. This kind of cartography will not work when we look at the period between 1909 and 1949. You know, and I think for me, this is, for a number of years, this has been a very fruitful place of inquiry, a fruitful site of inquiry, to look at how literary production proceeded from the railway junction towns, the cantonment towns. What were the kinds of dissimilar energies that came together in these places? How was it that, take a place like Meerut, for instance. It was a great center for the production of musical instruments. It also was a great site and center for Hindustani classical music. The musicians and the painters and the theater makers were all in one way or another in conversation. I think these rich sources of cultural nourishment might be lacking today. And I'm going to leap a little bit. You'll find the same kind of cross-cultural, across the arts kind of sense of cultural nourishment, even in the Bombay of the late 1940s, which we tend to ignore. Take Sultan Padamsee, Bobby Padamsee, who was young as he was. He was a powerhouse of cultural accomplishment. One of his younger contemporaries, somebody he mentored, was Alkazi. Alkazi goes on to, I mean, I'm kind of laying out a gharana that precedes the progressives. The last
leading
thing,
to the Kalkhand, as you say, right?
What's that?
Leading to the Kalkhand, the Prafulla's.
Yes, as Prafulla said in conversation, because I was circling around the progressives, and she said, "Ha Kalkhand hota, to Kalkhand hota, Bombay artists." And I thought, this is amazing. And that word Kalkhand, it gives you the sense of a time, mahal, a zamana, a chronicle. And you know, you need to look at the richness of the detail. The last play that Bobby Padamsee was working on before there was, he died in a car crash very young. It was a Tagore play. And in his interpretation, he was using Kathakali. So a very young Alkazi was being trained in Kathakali by a Kathakali master. This is the cosmopolitanism of South Bombay, which is, for obscure reasons, now seen as being somehow too westernized for its own good. The truth is that we've embalmed a lot of our own history. We don't see how very plural and diverse it was, and we need to retrieve that.
Speaking of oral history, I mean, one of the things you also said, and I'm just going to go back to Badrinath and then come back to Bhanu, is that, Badri mentions, and you've mentioned the three epochs, right? And
yes.
Then he goes on to say that the third epoch was, of course, heavily, or not heavily, but somewhat influenced by the Western post-impressionists and so on and so forth. But then he goes on to say that, a lot of these things, if you look at the basic principles of Indian art and, figurative and dance forms and, surrealism, Kathakali, and, I mean, it's all, we don't need to look outside and, we already have, 1,000 years culture, and it's difficult again to you have all these readings, and you read Ranjit Hoskote's write up, and you see scored Badr, but then you go outside again into the commercial world, and then I'm sure tomorrow's going to be about, okay, so let's discuss about the progressives. I mean, that just seems to be. I just hope that I know you've mentioned this a few times, and through this auction catalog, and that this discussion grows, and that we bring out more things that are not just focused on a specific group. Now, going back to Bhanu, of course, you mentioned Kolhapur, and you mentioned the art situation, and you mentioned Prafulla Dhanukar, Kalkan, the Bombay situation. I mean, obviously, if you read Bhanu's writings, I mean, a lot of discourse with other artists, Mulk Raj Anand, and all the other people happened, and then, of course, you've also, in the first question that you answered, you mentioned the JJ School and the kind of education that. So the point is that, I mean, can you place Bhanu's position, as a modernist painter at that time? I mean,
of course, yeah. As I've done in the essay, I would place her in the context of three genealogies. One would be precisely the JJ pedagogy that we've been discussing, including the development both of the so-called Bombay Orientalism and the emphasis on the Royal Academy style. This is the Solomon Dhurandhar pedagogy, as you might want to call it. That definitely was a very, very powerful part of her apprenticeship to the great tradition. Then there's the genealogy that I draw from the princely states, Kolhapur indeed. But when I say Kolhapur, I also mean the larger circulations, including Aundh, Indore, Travancore, Mysore, all of these places, because there was a considerable circulation of art producers. Ravi Verma is a good example to take for that kind of circulation among the princely states. What emerges from this? An openness to what was going on in Europe. There was a huge cosmopolitanism in the princely states. There was an openness to what was then called Art Nouveau, later to Art Deco. Who commissioned Mutesius? It was Yashwantrao Holkar to build the Manik Bagh, who was all set to commission also Brancusi. And I'm just offering one small detail in the larger tapestry. So when you think of Bhanu Rajopadhyay growing up in Kolhapur, remember that all these things are at work. And if you look at her work as you have, you've seen the work she did as a child.
Actually, that's a good segue. I'm going to bring up the presentation.
Great.
Yeah. So so you mentioned the work that she did as a child. So these are cut works that she would have done when she was 9 years old. I mean, so it's like 1938.
Yes. And you see how accomplished it is. There's also an argument here for ridding ourselves of this false hierarchy where, you put the oil paint, it's still persistent after all these years. The idea that the oil painting is somehow on the top and then everything else is a lesser art, watercolors, printmaking, cut work, if you please. I mean, I might just...
That Partha Mitra also said, I mean, you may have heard him that he considers, drawings to be more important. Of course, he didn't, not preparatory sketches, but actually completed drawings to be more important from an artist's perspective, because that really shows, a lot more, because, you work with your hand right in front of the paper, and
absolutely
a lot more detailed.
Yes.
Just going ahead, I mean, so like these are, you mentioned Solomon and JJ School. So, I mean, these are some of the classic things that she would have done while at JJ, I guess.
Correct, yeah.
Now, this is the work I was talking about, which Ahivasi had said that, use of maroon and rust, which Bhanu said that, this is the colors that she saw in Kolhapur. I mean,
correct.
So again, Bhanu's modernism is a confluence of, various ideas. I mean, she's in JJ working on something that looks, maybe Shergill-esque, but the colors are inspired from, Kolhapur. I mean, continuities, as you would put it.
Absolutely. I mean, you take Vajubai Bhagat, for instance, another artist active then, or look at the early works of Shavak Chavda, Bendre, Heber. Also in these works, there's the Jain further eye from early Jain illuminated manuscripts, which comes through as a heritage via Ahivasi and Dupeshwarkar. But we also see that formal experiments, pictorial experiments of this kind can be placed in alignment with what Jamini Roy and his circle had been doing for a while, drawing on the Potto traditions. So, these are things we need to celebrate. There were dialogues going on across schools, across cities. People were drawing on different elements of the pictorial tradition. So it's no use dismissing this as somehow pre-modern. This is not pre-modern. This is part of our vibrant journey towards the modern. It's part of our modern.
Right. This painting, in fact, when I was showing this to somebody, said, "Oh, it's a Gaitonde." I said, "No, it's not a Gaitonde."
Because there indeed are early student works by Gaitonde and Sousa, which
by and Prafulla as well.
And Prafulla.
Seeing a work very. So again, the JJ school influence. Can you talk a little bit about the prayers and the Lady in Repose you've written about extensively?
Yeah. I was amazed by this painting because it conveys, and she was not even 21 when she made this painting, and it's confident, it's robust, it's fully at one with the hushed, prayerful mood of its subject. We also know that at this point she'd found a studio space at a convent in Mazgaon. And we know from her letters and the undated notes that we have, which you and I both, through you, I've had access to those notes. We know that she was curious about the life of the cloister. What does it mean to be a nun? And there was a great deal of interest on her part. She was interacting with European nuns. She was also interacting with Keralite and Bihari and other students, intendants who wanted to take the veil. And in this work, all of this comes across in an extraordinary way. And this, sometimes we look at work like this and use the term cubist. It's not cubist at all. You also find experiments with a figure like this, for instance, in some of Sabawala's work going forward into the 50s. The question is, how do you represent the figure in a stylized way while yet holding on to the life of affect, to the visceral life of someone seeking communion with a larger force? How do you create that sort of sense of a cellularity, seclusion, the play of scale, and the deft use of symbolism? To me, this work, even if it is the only painting she'd ever painted, it would still stand alongside what we've been calling the masters, And it's just, I've been seized by this work ever since I've seen it. And it led me to think, what if she'd continued to be a painter? What might she have done next? Where might she have gone next? Which is not to say that I in any way deplore the path she took. I think when we think about Bhanu Athaiya's work, I think it also invites us to think that it's not about just becoming a painter in that singular way, which was so important to her male contemporaries. As she writes in a very realistic way, she needed to make her way in the world. She needed to form a career. And so she goes into fashion, she goes into costume design, she goes into the movies. She's no less creative for that. I mean, the creativity that she expressed through all of that. I'm thinking of the work she did on Amrapali, for instance. I mean, that work stands. It's, we take Diaghilev seriously, don't we? We think of Ballet Russe. Why should Bhanu Athaiya's work in costume design for the movies be any less than that? I don't believe in segregating these different areas of artistic production. I think we need to see them as a totality.
No, I agree. There has been, interestingly enough, a lot of discussion in art and fashion over the last few months.
Yes.
I was, pleasantly surprised. I thought they were marketing Bhanu Athaiya's auction. But who am I to complain? Let's move on to the next work. And of course, this was done by the KNMA, and then they had a whole series on art and fashion. I was like, okay, this could not be perfect timing.
Absolutely, yeah.
Another work that you...
Yeah. Again, for me, it's the way the figure is self-confident. I mean, when you think about someone who's had this Royal Academy style training in painting from the life, painting from the nude, there's no reticence here. There's no sense of shyness, of reticence. It's a female nude. It's straight up there. It dominates and it challenges the viewer, challenges the male gaze in a certain way. And also, I find very intriguing the way in which there's a convergence, if you will, of that tradition, the realistic nude portrait from the life, and something that is far more expressionist, where color expresses the festivity, the sensuality of this scene, and it just remains so robust and real to us across the many decades since it was painted. So again, it's a work that, I mean, formally, again, it's incredible how the conventions of a three-dimensional sort of naturalistic representation are just flattened up against the picture plane. So there's a very knowing quality. It's a young artist who's saying, look, I can deal with this. I can handle these different conventions. There's confidence, there's robustness, there's mastery in a proper formal sense of the different ingredients that go into the training of an artist. And what's produced here just lives on. It's memorable.
What I find interesting is, of course, we saw some artworks prior to this, which were, clearly JJ school and inspired. Now suddenly we see Prayers and The Lady in Repose, which, like The Lady in Repose, I find it very difficult to characterize. Is this figurative leading to abstract? Is this the colors, Fauvism? Is this, play of light? Is this, light and darkness? I mean, what exactly is this? And we have to also keep in mind that she's 21. I mean, the avant-garde nature of this is quite compelling. And there's also in her notes a point where she says that these works were in an informal get-together in a group, and a couple of people said that, oh, this maybe looks like this, maybe looks like that. But then she's like, but nobody was able to pinpoint exactly what. And she said, these are exactly my influences. This is, my life living in the convent. This is the ambient light I see there. Yep. This is Bhanu. I mean, yes. So, the attempts to characterize this work into what it, into like a box or some, some particular name is just not possible. And I find, an artist, I mean, there's a reason why she, I guess, was invited to be a part of the group. And I mean, you can clearly make out the prowess. I mean, that we see in this painting.
But it also speaks to the kind of visualities that were available for young people to see in the right circles in the Bombay of the late 40s and early 50s. We've been talking about some of the people who made that possible, cultural catalysts like Mulk Raj Anand at Marg, already there from 1946, Raja Rao at Chetna, Homi Bhabha, the scientist and patron of the arts, Alkazi, Bobby Padamsi, and then Alkazi, and that whole circle. And indeed, what I sometimes call the three magi, Schlesinger, von Leyden, and Langhammer, and a young Keku Gandhi starting out. So you're looking at diverse circles which intersected, which were looking at books, which did magic lantern slide presentations, where there was a bridge being built between Bombay and the other centers in India, but also outward to London, New York, Paris, Munich. So we're looking at a globalization well before that term was in use. We're looking at cosmopolitanism at work in these.
But what's interesting that the cosmopolitan or the globalization you say that is at work is I mean, she was a student essentially at the final year at JJ, and I mean, this is already way beyond her years, I guess. I mean, this is probably what I would expect from her 20 years down. You start your career, you do exhibitions, and then you go, you start, you come with your own language. And here we are, boom, I mean, Lady in Repose, you look at this, you can't even characterize what this work is all about. Well, Ranjit, thank you very much for the discourse we had. I'll just, end this thing by asking you to just re-emphasize, like as you've seen about Bhanu's modernism. You've mentioned Kolhapur. I mean, her upbringing, the teachings at the at school, and then the whole environment, the Kalkhand, of Bombay. And obviously, it is part of a continuity and not a disjoint. Something that was very disjoint. As you had asked me to ask you this question, like before the thing began, that what would happen if uh, we did not have the progressive artist group. I mean, what? I'll let you answer that. I mean,
Okay, I should begin my answer by saying that I this is not meant to displace the progressives. I mean, I love their work. I've admired it. I've written about it in curated exhibition. Well, last year I curated an exhibition called Horses of the Sun, which was it's like a retrospective scale exhibition of Husain. I've written on Tayyab. I admire Krishn's work. Akbar, Raza. I'm a trustee of the Raza Foundation. So this is not to say that the progressives themselves were in any way misguided. What is misguided is our insistence on focusing only on them to the exclusion of all the other dynamic processes that were going on and of which they were a part. So we're also doing them an injustice by sealing them off in this way. So when we look at an artist like Bhanu, not only do we see these rich receding contexts that we don't seem to have access to today, but I'd also situate her work in the art that was going on in Bombay through the 1930s and 1940s. Badri uses that marvelous term, the artists of the third epoch. That has been an important point of reference for Mortimer Chatterjee and Tara Lal in their curatorial reflections on the TIFR collection. It's been important to me when I worked with Susan Hapgood on the Abbey Gray collection at NYU. And I think we need to look far more closely at this. I mean, read Richard Bartholomew, read anyone who was writing in that period. They all talk about the Bombay artists. So if it is Bombay that you're fixated on, please also look at what Hebbar was doing, what Shavak Chavda was doing, what was going on, what alongside the progressives through the early decades of independent India was being done, say, by Adi Daverwala, by Pilu Pochkhanawala. There are just so many deeply intriguing and marvelous artistic practices.
You mentioned Kolhapur, of course, Babu Rao Painter,
exactly.
Lal Rahman. I mean, it's extremely important that I mean, nobody mentions their names. I mean,
because they've been written off in some way. And there was an exhibition some years ago at the NGMA called Rethinking the Regional, which Sheetal Darda set into motion. It brought many of these other centers in Maharashtra to prominence. It showed once again how lively these various places had been and still continue to be. It's just, remember also that many of the progressives began elsewhere. I mean, Sousa certainly drew inspiration from the fact that, leave alone Maharashtra, he drew inspiration from his Lusophone, Konkani-speaking background in Saligaon in Goa, which was Portuguese India at the time. Razak comes to us from central India, from early education in Nagpur. So again, let's not de-link these people from the larger context that they themselves emerge from.
Last but not least, I know you've spoken about these two works, but is there any, since we are having an auction, I have to ask this question again. I apologize, shameless. Like, is there any particular favorite that you might have, or anything I may have missed in any of the descriptions? I mean, even other than those two cut works, there are a bunch of other early works as well, and you can clearly make out that even before a formal training in art school, I mean, she was surrounded by art at home.
Absolutely. And I mean, we haven't talked about this here, but we have talked about it elsewhere and I've written about it. Her father was an amateur painter. He collected paintings and he was a filmmaker. So she really genuinely grew up in this ethos that was so open and receptive to things. But of my favorite paintings, this seems highly uncharacteristic of me, but I really love Rang Mahotsav.
Mm-hmm.
It seems like an uncharacteristic choice for me, but I'm just deeply intrigued by that work. When I look at it, Of course, one part of my mind says, yes, Ahivasi is training, but also how marvelous. This comes from a tradition that reaches back into the Ragmala cycles. It goes back to, and it looks forward to when someone like Husain would visit the Ragmalas and reinterpret them in his own inimitable way. So yes, from the works that we have here, the Rang Mahotsav would be my favorite.
It is different, and that work is I believe it's the back cover of the catalog.
As it happens, indeed.
I just close by saying that we are having a small capsule auction of Anna Sahib's works as well, and it is while trying to research Anna Sahib that I stumbled on the fact that anything that is probably written about him is probably in Marathi, and extremely difficult to find any information about. And this would be, he was not only an artist, he was a filmmaker, collector, but again, I mean, there's bits of information here, bits of information there. Yeah. A lot of, I hope over time, a lot more of this information is digitized and available for research scholars for reference, because a lot of these paintings from those times are not even signed. I mean, it's, signing, I think as a form came later, but it's very difficult to attribute without any literature, any documentation, and certainly about themselves. I mean, there are a few images of Anna Sahib that are available, but his movies and all, I mean, it's work in progress.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, Ranjit, thank you very much. Any last comments you may have?
To students of the Indian modern, to collectors, to curators, I would simply say that works like those of Bhanu Athaiya are really a challenge to us to do away with our preconceived historical frameworks. And they're also an invitation to expand our imagination and our consciousness in many ways towards these paintings and drawings, towards their contexts, but also somehow as aesthetes, as citizens. I'm going to touch on what you just said. The fact is that we cannot work only in one language. I mean, we might speak and write in one language, but if we are going to research this and rediscover these worlds for ourselves, we have to extend ourselves towards this material, towards these contexts. And that can only be done. Translation is one way of doing it, but honestly, we need to enter these life worlds through these diverse languages. I mean, as a poet and a translator, which is my other life, as you know, I'm deeply committed to a multilingual way of being and a multilingual sensibility. And I think this is true of the art world too. We cannot continue in this narrow Anglophone way. If we're going to connect with everything that has happened here within the Indian modern, it should just be a commitment to either refresh or to take on at least one other language. We should take that on as an ethic, actually.
All right, thank you very much. I will just end this with a quick small announcement, nothing related to Bhanu Athaiya, but the Atul Bose evening sale will now be held on December 3rd, because that was going to be a live auction and we have had a small COVID situation within the company. So the day sale, which is 100% purely online, will continue. But the evening sale has been deferred to December 3rd, which is the day after Bhanu's sale. Nothing changes in the Bhanu sale. So thank you very much. Thank you, Ranjit. I'm sure that this discussion will be remembered. And, we all love art. We all like different kinds of art, and we all like reading about art and art history. And I think at the end of the day, that's all that matters, and that's all that is the solution. You just enjoy collecting, read what you're collecting about, have an open mind. I mean, even I've been guilty of, focusing a bit too much on a particular area. It's a thing of the moment. But art is deep, art is rich in a country like India. I mean, art is historical, and so that's the beauty of collecting art in India. The opportunities are immense, and the lack of documentation sometimes can be a bonus because. Here we have the Bhanu Athaiya and Atul Bose estates coming up for auction, and these estates are extremely limited in size. People talk about, some of the other small estates, Gaitonde, and these estates are exactly what you see that's the size of the estates. So, given that the first time they're coming out in the market, I mean, I think this would be a tremendous opportunity for collectors. Anyway, Ranjit, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And appreciate it. And thank you, Zoom, for good sound quality. And if there are any questions, I will follow up with you. Otherwise, we'll keep chatting.
Super.
Thank you. Thank you again.
Great.